Welcome to this second session of World Bioethics Day at MSOE. This session will be on the challenges of neurodiversity. Just a few words before we start. I want to thank the Physics and Chemistry Department as well as the Electrical, Computer, Biomedical Engineering Department for their sponsorship of this event. This is organized by the International Chair in Bioethics Steering Committee, which is a committee of MSOE faculty and staff that organizes this annual event. And this is our 6th annual event. So in the next couple of years, watch again this time of year, we'll have another topic and another set of sessions. So welcome again. And with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and just take it from there.
Hello. My name is Angela Moreau. I am MSOE's Assistant Director of Accessibility and Advocacy here at our lovely institution. I also happen to be an individual who is neurodiverse. I was born with a reading disorder that impacts the way that I view, process, and understand languages.
I'm Debra Nygren. I am a senior here at MSOE in user experience, and I am on the autism spectrum.
Okay. And today we're hoping to kind of chat a little bit about the subtleties and complexities of neurodiversity, exploring some of the historical and ethical issues that have surrounded the neurodiversity movement, as well as present a little bit on the current ethical landscape in and out of the neurodiverse community. But before we do that, we have to talk a little bit about brains. And because it's November and it's Wisconsin, let's also talk about snow. I know a lot of people can struggle to understand neurodiversity when they themselves are not neurodiverse. So I like to use a lot of analogies and a lot of examples with my students. So I'm going to do that with you guys here today as well. And brains are a lot like snowflakes. Everybody has heard the old adage that there are no two snowflakes that are exactly the same. Everyone is unique, everyone is different. Brains are the exact same way. But yet, everybody, when you close your eyes and you picture a snowflake, we all kind of know what it looks like. Most of us close our eyes and we picture a little perfect, pretty, symmetrical, 6-armed crystal. That is what society expects snowflakes to look like. When it comes to brains, that's what society expects the brain to look like, how we should think, how we should process, communicate, and behave. But in reality, the likelihood that you're going to find a perfectly symmetrical snowflake is near impossible. They don't really exist. Most of them are asymmetrical, little lopsided, not quite as pretty as we picture in our heads. The same thing is true for brains. There are those individuals that, because of the different neural pathways in their brain, they process information, they think, they communicate, and they respond to their environment in ways that aren't that perfectly symmetrical 6-armed crystal. And we decide that those individuals meet the criteria to be neurodiverse. Now, neurodiversity is not a medical term. So there is no clear-cut definition. There is no clear, these people match and these people don't match, okay? Neurodiversity is a term individuals use to identify, because of the different neural pathways, how they think, communicate, and behave outside of our perceived standards. Individuals will oftentimes relate neurodiversity to different populations. There are times in which individuals refer to neurodiversity and autism interchangeably. There are other times where individuals will refer to neurodiversity as an umbrella term that encompasses not only autism, but also attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, Tourette's disorder, and other neurological conditions. Similarly to our last presentation where we talked about hard of hearing and deaf culture, neurodiversity has cultural connotations and oftentimes is intimately connected to how individuals define their identity and who they are. More often than not, outside the context of research, advocacy, and scientific community, neurodiversity is a self-identified term. Both Deb and I today, we identified as neurodiverse. But nowhere on my medical record will you see the terminology neurodiverse. It is not assigned to me by a doctor or a therapist. It appears nowhere in our DSM, which is our medical diagnostic manual. As you can imagine, the ambiguity of who is neurodiverse can lead to a lot of confusion and a lot of faulty generalizations, especially when we use the exact same term to reference different populations.
Although these conditions have been well established and the medical community has been diagnosing individuals with these conditions for decades, the concept of neurodiversity is only 25 years old. Emerging in the late 1990s, neurodiversity was first used in the context of a social justice movement that aimed to promote equality and inclusion for people who have neurological differences. Through online platforms and self-advocacy movements, more and more people have embraced the terminology and seen it as part of their identity. Although most often used in the diversity and inclusion space, the term is also used in research and education so that scientists, clinicians, and support services can view and address certain disabilities and neurological conditions as a collective whole. The term neurodiversity has increasingly become a buzzword that has been integrated into modern culture, fueled by the increase in people who identify as neurodiverse and their desire for equal access and inclusion. Per the CDC, in the past 20 years since the term neurodiversity was introduced, the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, has risen from 1 in 150 children to 1 in 36 children. As of 2022, an estimated 7 million children from the ages of 3 to 17 years have been diagnosed with ADHD, making up over 11% of U.S. children, and up to 1 in every 5 children has dyslexia. Most recent data suggests that 15 to 20% of the U.S. population is neurodivergent. Researchers suggest that these significant population increases are not due to more people being born with neurological differences, but rather better identification, awareness, and the push for inclusivity. The vagueness of who qualifies as neurodiverse is further confounded by the depth and breadth of presentations of neurodiversity. Between the several primary conditions defined as neurodiverse, there are huge differences in how individuals may think, communicate, or behave. Even within the same diagnosis, such as autism, you can have an individual who is nonverbal and unable to function on their own, with the same diagnosis as a high-functioning individual who can camouflage as a neurotypical. Similar to lumping all minorities together and expecting that they all have the same experiences, the experience of neurodiverse individuals is unique. Their needs are even more so. This creates challenges not only in identifying who is neurodiverse, but how do we advocate for the needs of such a diverse group who all have different needs? This ambiguity has fueled many ethical debates around the legitimacy of research or data that groups the entire population together when there is no true majority presentation for individuals within the population. Although all members have distinct neurological differences that impact the way they think, communicate, and behave, the ways that they do that and how it presents are so drastically different, the needs are so different, that it becomes difficult to advocate for the entire population in the same way or in the same breath. Medical professionals, scientists, and engineers are cautioned not to make hasty generalizations that the needs of some neurodiverse individuals apply to all neurodiverse individuals.
One of the second major challenges surrounding neurodiversity is that there are two competing paradigms in which neurodiversity is viewed. The first major paradigm is one of social justice, and the other is one focused on the medical model. I know in our first session, our participants had mentioned the difference between viewing a hearing impairment as an impairment versus it being a hearing loss, okay? Supporters of the neurodiverse movement argue that diversity is a natural variation of our human genome. The paradigm proposes that these variations are not inherently negative or positive, but just different. Similarly to, some of us are left-handed and some of us are right-handed. No hand is correct and no hand is incorrect, but rather the challenges that are associated with being left-handed are not fundamentally because you're left-handed, but in actuality are caused because the world is designed for right-handed individuals. The other paradigm, which is the medical model, diagnoses individuals such as those with autism, ADD, and disabilities, and view them as deficits, pathologies that need to be treated and hopefully we can cure. Although the term autism has been in existence for about a century, our understanding of the condition is relatively new. Before 1970, autism was thought to be part of schizophrenia. It did not appear as a separate diagnosis until 1980, when the DSM-3 defined it as 3 essential criteria, including the lack of interest in people, severe impairments in communication, and bizarre responses to your environment. The first reference to a spectrum was not until 2000, 24 years ago. And it echoed one of the leading research hypotheses that autism is rooted in our genetics. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, significant resources, research, and funding went to a project called the Human Genome Project, which sought to identify the genome sequence associated with autism in an effort to early identify autism in our genetic code, hopefully as early as before birth, in hopes of being able to ensure that children were not born with the condition. It was not until 2013, just 10 years ago, that the DSM finally updated our current view of autism and added the autism spectrum disorder. Despite this newest criteria being less stigmatization, it was not met with cheers from the autistic or neurodiverse community. The newest version of the DSM eliminated the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, something that many individuals had been diagnosed with and had contributed to a central part of their identity. Now, the medical community decided that that diagnosis, so central to who they were, no longer was a thing, and randomly reassigned them a new diagnosis, something called autism, that they felt no connection to and didn't feel like it accurately represented who they are. We still have students here at MSOE who will emphatically say that they are not autistic, that they have Asperger's syndrome, and they don't care what the medical community wants to call it. Their identity is their identity. This change in our understanding of autism played out concurrently to the growth of the neurodiversity as a civil rights movement, making it a prime battleground for these two opposing ideas. The medical model and the medical community seeks to fix an issue, find a way to eliminate the left-handedness or treat those left-handers so that they can write with their correct right hand. While the neurodiverse movement argues that neurodiversity should not be classified as a disorder, but embraced as a part of our diversity. They challenge society to change so that neurodiverse individuals feel welcome and belonged, rather than a world of left-handed individuals who have to deal with right-handed desks. Can we have tables that work for both right-handed and left-handed people? Changing the person to fit the world rather than changing the world so that that person fits. No one argues that individuals with autism or other forms of neurodiversity aren't faced with daily challenges. Environments are not designed to meet their unique needs. And oftentimes, neurodiverse people don't understand the unique needs of these individuals, how they communicate, how they react, and how they interact with the world around them. Neurodiversity is a spectrum, and some presentations of that spectrum are extremely debilitating. Individuals who are unable to function on their own without significant support. It can be heartbreaking for families. Supporting these individuals can put strain on school special ed services and state services. They require tremendous resources that can be a financial burden and time intensive. It's hard to make an argument that we want to not make this life easier, that we don't want to allow these students to have an easier life. As scientists, medical professionals, and engineers, we see problems and we want to fix them. Ask any parent if they would prefer to not have their child struggle with these daily challenges. They would jump at the chance. 3 years ago, my son was assessed for autism. Despite my role at MSOE, my strong advocacy for neurodiversity, expert knowledge of all the positive attributes, my own identity as neurodiverse, I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I had a hoped result. No one wants to see their loved one go through those challenges. Most people don't wish it for it themselves either. But there's a cautionary tale. Lessons learned from past mistakes, making assumptions where we shouldn't. Just as Delft culture and CI implants had a ripple effect on that person's identity, what impact can our quest for a cure have on those who identify as neurodiverse? The neurodiverse paradigm argues that we should not seek to cure or even treat neurodiversity, but rather focus on inclusivity and identify ways to adapt the world to meet the growing needs of its diverse members.
Just as biodiversity is critical for an ecosystem's survival, is human diversity an essential component for humanity's ability to flourish? What value does diversity of thought hold in society? Neurodiverse individuals are known for having numerous strengths that come with these differences. Individuals with autism can often identify patterns and trends and find the small errors that others have missed. Dyslexics are known to see the bigger picture and find the interconnections between pieces of information that don't seem to fit together for others. People with ADHD are known to be able to absorb large quantities of new information with speed that others cannot match. Neurodiverse individuals are known for visual processing skills and innovative problem solving. Many historical figures, such as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, Thomas Jefferson, Charles Darwin, Mozart, or even contemporary figures, such as Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, have displayed characteristics and traits that would have met our modern-day criteria for being neurodiverse. The list goes on with important figures from the field of politics, science, art, philosophy, engineering, and mathematics. Many credit the brilliant innovations in the technology, engineering, and STEM fields that these individuals have made to their neurodivergent characteristics. By removing the autistic characteristics from an individual, it fundamentally changes who they are as a person, how they interact with the world, and how their brain functions. By curing their autism, or even worse, snuffing them out of existence, we may be eliminating their contributions to society, causing irreparable damage to our advancements in technology, science, and culture. Or, let's view neurodiversity in the same way we view other types of diversity. Some can argue that individuals from an ethnic or cultural minority face the same challenges and discrimination that autistic individuals encounter. Often individuals of a certain age, cultural, or religious affiliation need reasonable accommodations to help them function in our society. Should the scientific community seek to eliminate the existence of a specific ethnicity or culture, a sexual orientation, people of a certain age? When asked those questions, many might be outraged and offended. How is diversity of thought different? Why is it different? If we are appalled by the idea of medical and scientific advancements, whose purpose it is to eliminate the diverse cultural aspects of what makes us who we are, why are we okay with the scientific community seeking to cure or eliminate the diversity of thought? Lastly, let's take this down to a personal level. Especially in the early 2000s, scientists, researchers, and even autism advocates were met with significant backlash from individuals with autism. One of the major issues presented by autistic self-advocates was a lack of autistic voices in organizations whose aim it was to help people with autism. Many autistic individuals, such as myself, also feel that the focus on finding a cure for autism sends a message that our lives don't hold value. Seeking to eliminate the problem or difference, rather than addressing the needs of individuals who live every day with autism, sends a message that nobody cares about our struggles and that our challenges are acceptable collateral damage while people work to cure or eliminate the problem for the future. That as a society, it would be easier or better for us to be dead or never have existed than to have non-autistic people be willing to work to establish reasonable accommodations to help us function in a world not designed to meet our diverse needs. It's also important to note that many autistic people feel like they have to defend themselves and their continued existence against those who focus on finding a cure. It's not as though we push back on finding a cure only because it would wipe out all the really smart autistic people. We don't want to be cured because it would change who we are. All autistic individuals deserve dignity and respect for their existence, whether they have an intellectual disability or are a savant, just like neurotypical people.
As the population of people who identify as neurodiverse continues to grow, individuals entering institutions of higher education and post-school employment who identify as neurodiverse continues to grow as well. In 2019-2020, 14% of all public school students between the ages of 3 and 21 who received special education services. The largest, fastest growing population within special ed services were individuals that would meet that umbrella of being neurodiverse. 9% of all children can be diagnosed with ADD, ADHD. Almost 10% have learning difficulties and disabilities. 2% with autism. Thanks to the increased understanding of these conditions, neurodiverse students are now able to pursue college in a way that they never were able to before. They're looking at post-secondary school employment and have opportunities that once were never considered. It's estimated that within the next decade, over 45% of children with autism will choose to attend post-secondary education. UWM-Madison estimates between 10 to 30% of all students currently enrolled in higher education identify as neurodiverse. Not only does this group face similar stigmas and discrimination that all marginalized groups do, but they also have the added complication of disability-related challenges. These challenges lead students with disabilities to have some of the lowest college graduation rates for any marginalized group. The national 6-year graduation rate for students with disabilities at 4-year schools is under 50%, compared to almost 70% for individuals without disabilities. For many of these students, the lack of understanding social nuances leads to isolation, decreased peer connections, and a lack of belonging, which research suggests is one of the #1 factors for college success and retention. Colleges have complex and changing schedules that often lack structure and routine. Teachers all have different communication styles, nuanced within all of their different expectations and communications, often unwritten. Everybody else just seems to know these. Sensory overload from crowded hallways, large student unions, and jam-packed lecture classes are constant stimulation. Despite having all the intellectual capabilities required to be successful, the structure and environment of college is not designed for the neurodivergent student to thrive. It's a right-handed desk for a left-handed student. Institutions like MSW have responded to this by meeting students where they're at, helping to create plans to support them while they're enrolled, meeting with students to determine their needs and see what we can do to help support them. But as numbers continue to grow, so do our ethical questions. Who determines what a reasonable accommodation is? When reasonable accommodations conflict, which one has the priority? When resources and money are tight, at what point do accommodations become an undue financial burden? And are these accommodations setting students up for success once they enter their professional careers?
The Americans with Disabilities Act, the law that governs the rights of individuals with disabilities, asks programs to make reasonable modifications to their policies, practices, or physical space to allow full access to their educational programs and facilities to individuals with disabilities, unless doing so would be a fundamental alteration or undue burden. The law, however, does not define what is a reasonable accommodation, fundamental alteration, or an undue burden, leaving schools and employers who are not medically trained to make these determinations on their own. MSOE, like many schools, relies heavily on the assessment and recommendations of treatment providers who specialize in these conditions to define what is reasonable. But that practice is not without its own challenges, as many providers are unaware of the reasonability of accommodations in academic collegiate settings. One of the many stigmas that individuals with disabilities live with every day is the suspicion that their accommodations are not only unnecessary, but an unfair advantage. Students often feel that faculty, classmates, and future employers will question their aptitude or if they really earned their degree because they received accommodations. Students often feel that they need to defend or rationalize their use of accommodations. This leads to individuals not registering with disabilities offices or request accommodations, or even when approved, use those accommodations.
One concern for schools and employers is with limited and finite resources, will neurodivergent students and employees put an undue strain on an already stretched system? Some disability accommodations do require extensive resources. They can be very time-consuming to facilitate and potentially come with a very high price tag. However, in most cases, the accommodations requested by neurodiverse individuals are actually quite minimal. They usually require very little cost or can be no cost at all. The ability to wear noise-canceling headphones or listen to music while you work. Providing flexibility to a dress code or allowing some flexible deadlines. Allowing extra time to allow individuals to process what's being asked and calculate how they will respond. Giving permission for students to use technology to turn readings into audio or dictate instead of writing. Some grace and understanding when someone may not respond or behave exactly as you would expect, without making assumptions of what that means about that person. None of these accommodations require extensive time, energy, or money, but rather an understanding of neurodiversity and how individuals think, communicate, and behave, combined with a willingness to be flexible rather than expecting people to just be different than how they are. Data shows time and time again that when provided with reasonable accommodations, this population is more than capable. They perform better. GPAs increase because they're more able to accurately reflect what they know on exams. Productivity increases because they're not bogged down with having to think or behave in a way that's unnatural. They're more comfortable and happier, more likely to graduate or be retained in a company for longer. But wait, remember those snowflakes we talked about? Each one is unique, no two alike. No two people have identical brains. We all think, communicate, and behave differently. Our needs are so different, and so must our reasonable accommodations be.
This is never more evident than within the neurodiverse community. We may have students with ADHD who seek out sensory input to help regulate their nervous system in environments that have lights and sounds and people bustling around. Students who cannot concentrate if it's too quiet and need background noise to focus. This seems reasonable, right? So let's create a space with background noise and sensory input to help them focus and be productive as possible. But yet their classmate may have autism and may experience sensory overload when an environment that provides a lot of sensory input. They may not be able to focus until things are absolutely quiet. Both requests are reasonable. Both are needed to help the students successfully think, communicate, and behave. But yet, how can we do both when their unique needs conflict with one another? Whose needs are more important, and how do faculty or supervisors determine which needs to accommodate and which needs will be left unmet? What happens when the majority of the class or office is neurotypical and their needs are different than the minority one neurodiverse individual? Do you meet the needs of the one over the needs of the many? Or say majority rules to meet the most amount of needs that you can? In the face of no clear, correct answer, some unfortunately choose indecision or to deny reasonable accommodations because they don't see an easy solution.
These are just some of the ethical questions that schools, faculty, service providers like myself, as well as employers are faced with on a daily basis. Unfortunately, there is no manual for neurodiversity. I wish I could tell you that there was one right answer. Do this and it will work and be correct in every situation. But just as diverse as a snowflake in a snowstorm, there's an infinite number of scenarios, all with unique circumstances, all with its own unique correct answer. As a quote-unquote expert in the field, even myself, I don't have all the answers. If I had to leave you with one piece of advice, it would be to engage in conversations. Engage from a place of mutual understanding and respect. Don't assume you know the answer. Don't assume your answer is the same for others. Try to solve the problem while engaging with others rather than solving it by yourself. Determine what is fundamentally needed versus what we do just because it's the way it's always been done. Compromise when you can, and when you can't, and engage in a conversation about what is possible and what you can do, and give grace when you cannot. Because all individuals, no matter if they're neurotypical or neurodiverse, deserve dignity, respect, and an opportunity to positively contribute. We're now going to allow for some time for any audience questions or comments. Please make sure that you use the microphone so that they can catch you on the live stream.
I'll go ahead and start us off. And I think you've almost addressed that with your ending comments, but I'd like to kind of revisit it. And that is, where do you think the responsibility of the neurodiverse individual lies with regard to accommodating the neurotypicals in the same way the neurotypicals should be trying to accommodate the neurodiverse individuals? So how do you strike that balance? And maybe some specific examples you could give us would be helpful with that in that regard.
Yeah, you know, when it comes to what is the responsibility, I would say the responsibility of the neurodiverse individual is to identify that there's a need and communicate that need with the proper individuals. That is their number one responsibility in the process. You know, I like to equate neurodiversity to other disabilities that are easier to understand. You know, we have several members of our deaf and hard and hearing community here. We would not expect them to start communicating how is convenient for us. I would never look at Terry and Margaret and tell them, you need to start speaking more clearly, or why are you communicating through sign language? Those are reasonable expectations. And they're also accommodations that are required for them to have equal access. I think it is the responsibility of everyone to allow everyone equal access. Now, if Mary and Terry were doing something that restricted my access and didn't allow me to communicate, if they were to come up here and say, suddenly this entire event will happen only through ASL. Okay, that would be probably something that we needed to talk a little bit more about. And it would be a challenge. I wouldn't be able to do that kind of a presentation. But the vast majority of the times, individuals with disabilities, whether it's neurodiversity or something else, they don't ask the community to communicate the way that they do. They ask for understanding and grace to allow them to communicate the way that they do, and to have some mutual respect as we navigate through different styles of communication.
Hello, and thank you for being here. I appreciate your presentation. I'm from the Career Connection Center, and we strive to be neuroaffirming in that space for all of our students. And so I guess I'm curious, this is a generation in particular where you have individuals that have formal diagnoses and those that don't, those that may identify more strongly with a diagnosis and those that don't, those that maybe identify as being neurodivergent or autistic but do not consider themselves disabled. So how, as a service, our service, your service, how are we best to communicate with the student body and make sure they understand all of the resources available to them? Thank you.
Okay. So the biggest thing that I can say is communicating that we accept everyone however they are. I frequently will caution people to not make assumptions. If someone tells you that they're neurodiverse, don't make an assumption that you know what that diagnosis means, what that presentation is, whether they feel like their identity is neurodivergent or not. And then it goes in the other way. You know, just because someone tells you that they're neurodivergent, don't make an assumption that that means one thing. You know, there's this phrase that is often used in the autistic community, that if you've met an autistic person, you've met an autistic person. No two are alike, and everyone is very unique. So trying to not make generalizations, trying to not assume that you understand what their experience is, ask. You know, I'll speak on behalf of myself. I have never once been offended when someone has asked me for clarification or has asked how my disability impacts me or what needs would help to allow me equal access. So rather than making the assumption, engage in that conversation. How can we best support you? What could we do to help you better prepare for your job interview? What level of disclosure do you want to do? Ask them and let them guide, and then you're supporting based on what they're telling you is their wishes and where they're at.
I would also like to say something. I like that you described that different people identify certain ways, and I think it's important to not police how other people identify themselves. I recall I was doing a project, I think in middle school, regarding autism, and I kept saying autistic people, and that's called identity first language. And the teacher kept saying, no, it's people with autism. She made me change everything to say people with autism. That's called person first. And in general, normally all disorders or identities, a lot of them are, you would use person first, but I think it's inappropriate to tell an autistic person that they can't refer to themselves however they want. So I think that's important to ask them, how do they identify themselves, so you don't say something that they think is offensive and you just don't know. So ask them how they would prefer to identify.
Hi, my name is Gosha. I'm from Cactus Plus, which is an new arts education nonprofit here in town. My question is about kind of where so-called emotional disabilities fit into the neurodiversity world, things like depression, anxiety, and things that are, I guess, in the DSM, and whether they do have a place in that in this conversation. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so a little bit of a technical question. I'm first going to approach it from a medical model, because you mentioned the DSM. The DSM is a manual that articulates who can be diagnosed with what and what that criteria is. So for individuals who have a medical diagnosis, a lot of the conditions that are under that diversity umbrella, they are medical diagnoses. But it's important to note that not everyone with a medical diagnosis identifies as neurodiverse, and not everybody who's neurodiverse has that official medical diagnosis. So it's a little bit of a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, but then there's people who only attribute their identity to one of the two spaces. I will say, when it comes to neurodiversity in general, anxiety and depression tend to be comorbid conditions that we see very commonly with neurodiverse individuals. We had said during the presentation that there is no clear definition of who is neurodiverse and who isn't. There are some people who believe there are types of anxiety that do qualify as neurodiverse. There are other people who emphatically will tell you no, that that's not a condition that impacts your neural pathways. This is one of those ambiguous things that there is no right or wrong answer, and it depends on who you talk to, who's engaged in the conversation, and what perspective they bring to the conversation.
So I'm going to come at it from an opposite perspective, which is, I think we do have a lot of undiagnosed students. I know, Angela, you and I have talked about this a lot. We have a lot of undiagnosed students who probably are some form of neurodiverse on campus. Now, if they're not officially diagnosed, they can't come to you and officially get accommodations until they have that diagnosis. But how do you go about, and this is for both of you, how do you go about figuring out what sort of accommodations make sense to you? And I'm thinking about this less from an official accommodations perspective and more from there's a lot of students in this room and probably a lot online thinking about how can I make college a little easier for me? And so not think about formal accommodations, but thinking about like self-reflection and how do you kind of figure out what you need to be able to work in your best way.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that two different directions. The first one is MSUE as a whole has done a lot of work on something that's called universal design. Katie herself helps me quite a bit with that. And that is kind of an educational pedagogy where it doesn't matter if someone has a diagnosis, and it doesn't matter, what your background is, how you learn, how you think, how you communicate. I want to make my class accessible to everybody, no matter how you come. And a lot of times, that could be an individual with a disability, but let's say you're a non-traditional student. Let's say you're a parent. Let's say you're a veteran. Let's say, you just work 30 hours a week and you just have a different, place of your life that you're in. It's how do we make those classes so that they're accessible for every student? That is an educational pedagogy that some faculty feel more strongly about one way or another. It's not been necessarily universally accepted throughout all of education, shall we say. But there are a lot of inroads that have been made at MSOE specifically to push that educational pedagogy. As an actual student, the biggest thing that I can say is have conversations with your faculty. Your faculty, and there are a couple in the house today, they are humans, they are people, they want to help. So I think that we as humans automatically will make the assumption that you're just like us unless we hear otherwise. So don't be afraid to communicate with your faculty about how you may think or process information or communicate differently, and engage in a dialogue about what options might exist and how you might be able to better access the course material, reflect what you know, and be able to kind of interact with that class.
If you're having problems with a class and you want to make it not suck so bad, you can start identifying small things, like if this one thing could change and I could do it this way instead. I think that would take a lot of pressure off of me, thinking about something small you can start with, because it's kind of hard to ask someone like older than you and wiser than you to like change how they're doing something. You can just start with something small and say, it would be a lot easier for me if I could do it this way, and it's easier to ask like that. I think that's a good starting point if you're unsure.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Some of you have met me this morning. I got my associate's degree in electrical engineering from WCTC, along with some of my transfer credits from MSOE here. And I'm on the autism spectrum. I take it as a gift. I think very analytically. And so my question for today will be for the student. It's lovely to see other people on the spectrum as well. And how do you stick up for your needs and ask your professors and the faculty at MSOE what your academic needs are, whether it is extended test time or a scribe?
Thank you. I am very lucky and grateful that I have a great student accessibility services coordinator that I can communicate with her what I need, and she knows a lot of the questions to ask to determine what I need, because a lot of the time I'm not entirely sure what is available to me or what I need or what I don't need and I could live without. But as I've gotten older and gotten more into like online autistic spaces, I've gotten a lot more confident in advocating for myself and saying, no, I can't do it this way. I'm going to do it this way instead. A lot of the times, like I need an earbud in, like in the middle of class, and if someone tries to say something to me, I might, I will assert myself and say, no, I need to do it this way. Sorry if you don't like it, but this is just how I am, and there's nothing I can really do to change that, and there's nothing you can do to change that. I think that's my biggest piece of advice, is to just assert for yourself.
Hi, I'm actually surprised. I was looking at the microphone and I thought it would be too high for me, but it's not. Okay, so my question, I guess I start off by saying I'm on the spectrum, but almost anyone would not believe me, or I'm constantly being rejected, even by doctors who will tell me.
I believe you.
I have like doctors who still tell me I'm wrong, and it wasn't until, so I have really bad like sensory processing issues like with my hearing, and I didn't get diagnosed until I had like a mental health crisis because I had so many sensory issues and didn't know what was going on, and everything was so loud and overwhelming. And it also wasn't until I was diagnosed that I paid $3,000 to get a neuropsych test. So I want to say, like, it's very hard for people to get diagnosed like me. And even when I am, lots of people, I'm still being rejected. But I guess what I want to say is it's a privilege to be diagnosed because it's so hard to get that diagnosis. And there are these people like me who struggle for a long time who have been diagnosed, and I believe that they too deserve accommodations. And how do we still support these undiagnosed people who are struggling, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so I know this topic came up in the last session as well. Unfortunately, a lot of thing does come down to finances. And getting a neuropsych eval and getting some of these diagnoses can be very time consuming. It can be very costly. Insurance does not always cover it, especially when you have a high achieving student who can camouflage well in a neurotypical world. Unfortunately, a lot of what we do through my office, through HR, things like that is all based off of a law. And the government says that you need to have a formal diagnosis before we can assist. So vote, talk to your politicians. That's definitely something that as a community, we need to enact change. When I think back historically here, a lot has gotten better, even, since I was diagnosed. Laws have been changing, things have been getting easier for people to get diagnoses, but we aren't quite where we need to be yet. And that's where that piece of advocating for yourself and having those conversations with faculty and helping both employers and faculty understand the concepts of universal design and how there are some really simple, easy, let's not use the word accommodation, but really simple, easy things that they can offer to you or provide that can make a world of difference in your ability to interact and communicate in the world.
I'd like to say something too. For self-diagnosed people, which I believe that self-diagnosis is valid because it is hard to get diagnoses. And if you truly believe something and it affects you, like Angela had said, like sometimes like the laws are just like the school is not required to provide you accommodations. But another way to advocate for yourself is to, like Angela said, and I answered the previous question, email professors, communicate with them somehow, because if you don't ask, then it's definitely for sure never going to happen. So you need to at least try and explain, like, I'm having problems with this. I don't have a medical diagnosis, but this is really a problem for me, and maybe come up with suggestions on what they could do to accommodate. Because if you just say, oh, I have this thing, sometimes the faculty doesn't know how best to help you. So I'd maybe like give an example of like this, could you do this one thing? It would make my life a lot easier. So try, I know it might be scary to email a professor and ask this big thing, but if you don't try, then it definitely won't happen. If you do try, there's a possibility it might happen, so go with that.
Thank you. I think we're at the end of the hour, so students can get off fast. I don't know, I don't self-identify as being scary. Do professors really scare people that much? I'm kind of surprised by that. Oh, I'm getting nods, yes, okay. All right, well, thank you, panel.